Okay, so in this video, we're actually going to take a look at the first of two markets, the money market, and then the other part of this topic is the loanable funds market, and we're going to deal with that one in a later video. But this is the last topic in the financial sector unit, and it's really where we show the graphical model to illustrate some of the ideas that we've been discussing. So the first thing to know is that there is actually a market for money, and money in this context, we can, if you feel like you need a specific like hard monetary aggregate, we could say it's M1, but in general, this money definition, we're going to kind of leave a little bit vague as we deal with the money market. So we'll kind of draw a quick little graph here, and I'm actually going to explain as I talk through this graph what the source of money supply and money demand are. So we have here quantity of money on the x-axis, and then as we know the price of money, we don't use P, we call it I. And this is just a nominal interest rate, so we can say I sub n for nominal interest rate, right? And we'll write that off to the side in case we forget. So nominal interest rate. And the money supply is set by central bank activities, right? There are three of them, in fact, shifters of money supply. So this actually should say three shifters of money supply. But these three money shifters of supply are just going to change the supply left and right. So for example, an increase would be to the right, that's an increase, and a decrease would be to the left. So decrease to the left. And so if the Fed does open market operations, that could change the money supply, right? Because we learned in the previous video that if they buy bonds, the money supply gets bigger, and that would be a shift to the right. Or if they sell bonds, that would get smaller, a shift to the left. There's also changed the discount rate. So we learned that as another tool of the monetary policy. And if they increase the discount rate, that would decrease the supply of money. And if they cut the discount rate, that could increase the supply of money. And then last, they could change the reserve ratio, the required reserve ratio. We should say required reserves ratio. And that required reserve ratio, if they increase it, that would decrease the money supply because less lending would take place. But if they decrease the required reserve ratio, then banks could loan out more, and so we'd see an increase in supply of money. Now, there's a downward sloping demand curve for money. So these are the demand curve for money and the supply curve for money. And we would observe that there's a downward sloping demand for money because as the interest rate falls, we find that the quantity rises. So at very, very low interest rates, the quantity demanded of money is relatively high. But as the interest rate ticks upward, the quantity demanded of money gets less and less and less, right? We move up this demand curve. And the reason is that imagine that you have $30,000 in your wallet and you are foregoing interest on financial assets, right? Because you have cash in your wallet. You have $30,000 in your wallet. Well, it's a pretty low opportunity cost of doing it if the interest rate is low. So if you could only make, say, 0.5 percentage point of interest on your money, holding it in cash is really not a big deal. But if there's really high interest rates, we would say that holding money, there's a high opportunity cost, so you would only want to hold a very small quantity of money in those circumstances. So we would say that as the short-term and nominal interest rates go up, there's a higher opportunity cost of holding money, so the quantity demanded of money will decrease. Now, there's three underlying things that create the demand for money, three sources, if you will, of the demand for money, and they're listed here: transactions, speculative, and precautionary demand. And these are really why the demand for money exists in the first place. You might say to yourself, why do we need money? Well, because I would like some more money. Well, would you like more? Sure. But these are the different reasons why people need it. They need it in order to conduct transactions. They need to buy and sell stuff. They need it in order to buy investment opportunities. Now, maybe we should say here, financial assets. So as a real example of this, I hold some money in a brokerage account, in a Robinhood account. And I hold some cash in that account on the off chance that maybe there's a stock I have my eye on, a financial asset, that I might want to buy. And if the value of that stock gets cheap enough, or if I decide I want to buy it, well, then I'm going to use this speculative demand money to actually buy the financial asset. So it's kind of almost like a subcategory of transactions demand in that way, but we break it out because it's separate from buying goods and services. This third type of demand for money is called precautionary demand. And this is almost like in case of an emergency, right? And something might happen. I might lose my job, a tree might fall on my house, something bad could happen, and so I need a little bit of money for that reason as well. Now, we're going to talk about the demand shifters, and it's actually useful to understand these three sources of money demand to be able to understand the demand shifters for money demand. So demand for money could increase, right? You could see the shift to the right. You could go from D to D1, or you could see a decrease in the demand for money. You could see it decrease. And these demand shifts can happen for a variety of reasons. But the better way to think about it is that anything changing the need for money at any or all interest rates would change the demand for money. So, for example, these first two are rooted in a change in transaction demand. So for example, if there's higher price levels, unexpected changes in price levels, then you actually are going to need more money to make purchases. Because imagine you have a shopping cart full of things that you're pushing, and all of a sudden those things become twice as expensive because price levels increase. Well, you need twice as much money, regardless of what the interest rate is, you need twice as much money to finance those purchases. So transaction demand would rise, and you would see an increase in the money demand. Now, really quick here off to the side, I'm going to show you what that would do. Well, it would increase money demand, so the quantity of money out there, right, Q star would stay the same, but you would go from, say, interest rate 1 to interest rate 2. So you would see a higher interest rate when demand for money goes up. So there's the possibility, right, that we're thinking about interest rates changing as a result of something like inflation. And that was kind of the story that we told the other day when I said that, let's kind of go back and show you. It's actually in this lecture when we said if price levels go up because aggregate demand rose, then we actually would expect the interest rate to rise. And the reason why, if this happens, then the demand for money goes up. So therefore, this happens, the interest rate rises. So if price levels go up, demand for money goes up, so the interest rate would go up. Now, the second reason why money demand could change, and it's again related to transactions demand, is if GDPR, real GDP or national income, goes up. In other words, imagine instead of just one shopping cart, you have two shopping carts, right? If you have two, you're going to need twice as much money. Even if the prices of those goods and services stay the same, well, there's twice as much output, right? So another way to say this would be Y or output. And if output rises, you need more money in order to facilitate that. A third thing that could affect money demand would be money technology. And think about this, that go all the way back to the 1950s for a second. In the 1950s, they didn't have mobile payments on cell phones. They didn't have credit cards for the most part. They didn't have automatic teller machines. They didn't have really national bank chains. So if you were taking a trip driving across the country, going 2,000 miles across the country, and you were driving, you would have to pay for gas, you would have to pay for hotel, you'd have to pay for car repair, you'd have to pay for everything you wanted in cash. So there would be a higher demand for money back in the 1950s than maybe nowadays. And in fact, if you think about it, older people often do have more cash on them, or they carry more in their checking accounts. And it's because of that legacy of the fact that they're not used to having easy and ready access to what are called near monies, like credit cards and things like that. And they wouldn't have access to something like an ATM where you could get money anytime. So if there's increases in money technology, that could actually reduce our demand for money because you don't really need to carry around $5,000 all the time, Grandma. The fourth thing here would be changes in institutions, and this is the idea that it really comes down to precautionary demand. Right? This is the idea that if you think that your money is safe in the financial sector or it's safe in the banks. Okay, so sorry about that interruption here. I have to clip that. But in short, if you have more faith in kind of financial institutions, if you have more faith in banks, and then you don't really need to be as precautionary about the future. If you think that your society, your economic and political stability is high, then you actually have higher demand for non-money assets like stocks, right? You'd be more comfortable investing in the stock market. And so you don't really need as much money as a precaution. So there's less money demand. Now, the last thing to teach you, right, aside from all this stuff about the money market, is something kind of interesting that happens that's the relationship between interest rates and bond prices. So I'm going to quickly draw a little picture here that will illustrate this idea, or at least I'll try to. So my pen's running out. It's a good thing we're almost ending. So imagine that you had an interest rate of 5%. Right, and a supply of money and a demand for money. And if you were to loan money to the government and buy a bond, and you loan money to the government, bonds pay a fixed rate of interest for the entire term of the bond, for the most part. There's some exceptions, but generally we'll say that this is true. And let's say you buy a 10-year bond. You buy a treasury bond. So the government has your money, but every single month they pay you a little bit of money in interest, and they pay you 5% interest because that's the interest rate that's in the money market. Now, all of a sudden, some change in money technology or GDP or whatever, something happens, and demand for money goes up. Ta-da! And now there's a new interest rate of 7%. So we're going to write old and new. Now, your bond is still paying 5%. So what we would say is that your bond is not as valuable now because new bonds that are going to be issued, they don't exist yet, but we know they will, are going to be issued at 7%. And so your bond is only paying 5%. So if you wanted to sell your bond to somebody else, you'd actually have to sell it at a discount because it doesn't pay as high a rate of interest as these new bonds that are going to be issued. So we would say that if the nominal interest rate goes up, the price goes down of previously issued bonds because new bonds pay those new higher rates. And likewise, we could say that if you had the reverse situation, right? Imagine that your bond was paying 5% interest. Okay, and again, I'm sorry that my pen's running out here, but then all of a sudden something decreased the demand for money, and the new interest rate was 3%, then your bond is now more valuable than the bonds that are going to be issued next week and the month from now and 2 months from now, because your bond pays a higher rate of interest. So because if nominal interest rates go down, we would say the price of previously issued bonds, like yours paying 5%, will go up. The price will go up. And so we say that bond prices and interest are inversely related, right? Or inversely related, because if interest rates go down, bond prices will rise. If interest rates go up, bond prices will fall. So that's it for the money market. Hopefully you've taken some good notes and annotated yours, and I'll see you next time.